The Duke of Ashworth did not look at his wife once during the entire carriage ride to Chatsford Manor. Elena sat across from him in the dim interior, the sapphire silk of her gown pooling around her like still water. He stared out the window, gloved fingers tapping an absent rhythm on his knee. She had worn the color he once remarked upon, years ago, a careless comment she had treasured like a pressed flower. He did not notice. When they arrived, he stepped down first and offered his hand, his touch impersonal as a footman's. She took it, and the moment her slipper touched gravel he released her and strode toward the great doors, leaving her to follow in the wake of his indifference. Inside, the drawing room blazed with candlelight and polite malice. Elena found a place near the wall, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the seams bit into her palms. Her husband stood at the center of a laughing circle, Lord and Lady Pemberton at his elbow. She watched him smile, a rare, fleeting thing, and felt the familiar hollow ache bloom beneath her ribs. She was not part of that warmth. She was a figure at the edge of a painting, visible but irrelevant. Lady Pemberton's voice cut through the hum like a shard of crystal. "Your Grace, your Duchess seems quite the ornament this evening. So silent and still, one forgets she is even here." Duke's gaze drifted toward Elena, cool and unreadable as a winter sky. He lifted his wineglass. "She is well enough," he said, and turned back to his conversation. The words did not strike her, they settled. They pressed into her chest slowly, stone by stone, until she could barely draw breath. No one rushed to her defense. No one even looked. She stood very still, letting the familiar numbness spread, and when the dinner gong sounded, she walked to the table on legs that felt borrowed. She did not speak for the remainder of the evening. No one asked her to. That night in the carriage home, the silence was absolute. The Duke closed his eyes as if sleeping, though she knew he was not. She studied the sharp line of his jaw, the aristocratic slope of his nose, the mouth that had never once spoken her name with tenderness. She had loved him. She had loved him with the quiet, desperate devotion of a woman who believed that patience could earn affection. But patience was beginning to feel like slow starvation. When they reached Thornwood Hall, he murmured something about estate business and disappeared into his study. The door clicked shut with terrible finality. Elena climbed the great staircase alone, her skirts whispering against the marble, and let herself into her cold bedchamber. The fire had not been lit. She did not ring for a maid. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her sapphire gown, and stared at the dark window until the glass turned grey with dawn. She was 23 years old, and she was utterly, invisibly alone. The days that followed stretched into an unbroken string of grey mornings and silent afternoons. The Duke departed for London within the week, leaving only a brief note to inform her of his travel. The note was addressed to Her Grace in his secretary's hand. Elena read it once, then placed it in the drawer where she kept all the other scraps of his indifferent correspondence. The drawer was nearly full. She had married him 3 years earlier, a union arranged by her father to settle debts and by the Duke to secure a quiet, uncomplicated duchess. She had arrived at Thornwood Hall trembling with hope, believing that shared life would grow into shared affection. The hope had withered slowly, starved of light. The Duke was never unkind. He was never cruel. He was simply absent, a figure who moved through the house like a ghost, who spoke to her with the distant courtesy one might offer a stranger at a posting inn. She had tried in the beginning to reach him. She had asked about his boyhood, his interests, his dreams. He had answered with polite monosyllables and then excused himself to attend to ledgers. Eventually, she stopped asking. Now the vast estate swallowed her days. Thornwood Hall was beautiful and cold, its corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who stared down with the same remote expression her husband wore. The staff were efficient and impersonal. The gardens, once the pride of the county, had been neglected for decades, left to tangle and decay. She had no friends in the neighboring families, for the Duke rarely entertained, and she lacked the confidence to forge connections alone. She was a duchess with a title and no voice, a wife with a husband who did not see her. It was in the garden that she finally began to breathe. She discovered the walled garden on a damp March afternoon, wandering without purpose beyond the manicured lawns. A crumbling stone archway, half swallowed by ivy, opened into a world forgotten by time. Inside, an ancient glass house sagged on rusted iron ribs, its panes filmed with grime. Rose canes had run wild, tangling across gravel paths in thorny waves. A fountain stood dry, its basin filled with dead leaves. The air smelled of wet earth and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of vanished blossoms. Elena stood in the center of that ruined place and felt something shift inside her. The garden was broken, unseen, abandoned, and yet it still breathed. It still waited. She began returning every morning. She borrowed gloves and a trowel from the head gardener's shed, ignoring his startled look. She cleared the gravel paths, pruned the roses, scraped moss from the stone benches. The work was physical and mindless, a balm for thoughts that had circled endlessly in silence. Her hands blistered and calloused. She did not care. Inside the glass house, she found the remnants of a collection, pots of desiccated soil, labels faded to illegibility, the skeletal remains of plants that had once been cherished. And tucked behind a broken shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound journal. She opened it with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, pressed flowers, delicate watercolor sketches of botanical specimens. The name inscribed on the flyleaf was Margaret, Duchess of husband's mother, dead 20 years. Elena read the journal by candlelight that night, alone in her room. The late Duchess had been a passionate botanist. She had collected rare plants, corresponded with horticultural societies, drawn every petal and leaf with devoted precision. Her words spoke of the joy she found in nurturing living things, the patience it required, the quiet reward of watching something bloom. A strange, painful kinship rose in Elena's chest. She had never met the woman, yet she felt seen by her, understood. She closed the journal and pressed it to her heart, and for the first time in years, a tiny, fragile seed of hope cracked open inside her. She began to draw. As a girl, she had filled sketchbooks with wildflowers and herbs, pressed specimens between the pages of her father's neglected books. Her governess had called it a charming pastime, but her father had dismissed it as frivolous. "A lady does not grub in the dirt," he had said. She had hidden her sketches away and never spoken of them again. But now, with Mugrut's journal as silent encouragement, she bought paper and pencils from the village and began to record the garden's slow resurrection. She drew the unfurling fern fronds, the shy bluebells, the moss's velvet texture. She studied botanical texts in the estate library, teaching herself the Latin names, the anatomy of stems and stamens. She discovered that she had a gift, not merely for accuracy, but for capturing the living essence of a plant, the way light moved through a petal, the subtle curve of a seeking tendril. The garden began to respond. By late spring, the roses were blooming again, the glass house was clean and glazed, and the fountain murmured over mossy stones. Elena had reclaimed it all with her own hands. She felt stronger, steadier, more herself than she had since her wedding day. The loneliness did not vanish, but it transformed. It became solitude, and solitude became a quiet companion rather than an enemy. The Duke returned from London in June. He arrived unannounced, as he always did, striding into the hall while Elena was still in her gardening dress, a smear of soil on her cheek and a trowel in her hand. She froze, her heart lurching with the old, desperate hope. Would he notice? Would he see her? He glanced at her, then at the trowel. "You have been occupied, I see. Do not catch a chill." He walked past her into the house, calling for his valet. Elena stood motionless in the great hall, the trowel cold in her palm. The hope folded up and died, as it always did. She did not weep. She had no tears left for such moments. She simply returned to the garden, to the plants that did not turn away, yet something was different this time. In the past, his dismissal would have crushed her for days. Now the ache was still there, but it was shallower, more distant. The garden had given her something that was solely hers. She did not need his approval to breathe. A week later, he informed her they would host a small shooting party. A few gentlemen from London, Lord Ushby and his brother, and a naturalist fellow, William Ushby, I believe. He wishes to study the local flora. Eleanor's pulse quickened at the word flora, but she kept her expression composed. "Of course, Your Grace." Guests arrived on a golden July afternoon. Lord Ushby was a bluff, cheerful man, his brother quiet. But the third guest, Mr. William Ushby, was not what Eleanor expected. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with spectacles and gentle brown eyes that held an attentive, unhurried intelligence. He was a second son of Viscount Lunutst, she learned, a man who had forsaken politics for science, traveling the country to catalogue native plants. At dinner that first evening, the talk turned to estate management. Eleanor sat in her customary silence, her gaze on her plate, when Mr. Ushby's voice addressed her directly. "Your Grace, I understand Thunust's gardens were once quite renowned. The late Duchess, I believe, had a notable collection. I would be most interested to see what remains." She looked up sharply, catching her husband's faintly surprised expression. "The gardens are recovering," she said quietly. "I have been working in them." Duke's Fork paused for a fraction of a second. He said nothing. Mr. Ushby smiled, and it was a smile that seemed to light something gentle behind his eyes. "Then I must insist on a tour, if you would be so kind." Tour took place the following morning, with a maid trailing at a proper distance. Eleanor led Mr. Ushby through the walled garden, and as she spoke, the words came more freely than they had in years. She showed him the glass house, the rescued roses, the rare alpine plants she had coaxed from the soil. She found herself explaining her methods, her failures, her small triumphs. He listened with genuine fascination, asking perceptive questions, never interrupting. On a stone bench near the fountain, she had left her sketchbook. He saw it, asked permission, and opened it with the reverence of a scholar handling a sacred text. His expression changed as he turned the pages. When he looked up, his voice was hushed. "Your Grace, these are extraordinary. The detail, the life in them. I have seen professional botanical illustrators whose work does not compare. Have you ever exhibited?" She flushed and shook her head. "It is only a private pastime. It is a gift," he said, and the simple certainty in his tone made her throat tighten. "There is a county botanical exhibition in 6 weeks at the Assembly Rooms in Mudford. You should submit something, anonymously if you prefer, but these deserve to be seen." No one had ever spoken of her work that way. No one had ever seen it. She clasped her hands to hide their trembling. "I could not. My husband would not." "Your husband," Mr. Ashby said gently, "does not need to understand for the work to have value, but perhaps in time he will." She did not promise, but he had planted a seed. Over the remaining days of his visit, they spoke often, always in the garden, always with propriety, always about plants and art and the quiet wonder of growing things. He never touched her hand, never made a remark that could be misconstrued. He simply saw her, and in seeing her he made her feel real. The Duke noticed. He noticed the way Eleanor's voice had a new lightness when she spoke of the garden at dinner. He noticed the way Mr. Ashby's attention lingered on her with an admiration that was entirely respectful and yet somehow intolerable. He noticed the absence of the pleading, hopeful gazes she used to cast in his direction, the ones he had ignored for years. She no longer looked to him for permission to exist. She no longer looked to him at all. One evening, passing the library, he heard laughter. He paused, his hand on the duffrum. Through the crack, he saw Eleanor and Mr. Ashby bent over a large folio, their heads close but not touching, the candlelight gilding their profiles. She was pointing at something, her expression animated in a way he had never seen. Mr. Ashby laughed again, a warm, easy sound. The Duke felt it then, a sharp, cold, unfamiliar sensation that twisted beneath his ribs. He did not have a name for it at first. Later, lying awake in his silent bedchamber, he understood. It was jealousy. He was jealous of the way another man made his wife smile. He did not like himself for it. He did not like himself at all. Mr. Ashby departed at the end of the week, but the damage, or the gift, was done. Eleanor submitted 3 framed botanical illustrations to the Mudford exhibition, signed simply E. Ashworth. She told no one. On the day of the exhibition, she dressed in her simplest muslin and traveled to the Assembly Rooms with only her maid, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it could be heard in the next county. The room was crowded with gentry, clergymen, and keen amateur naturalists. Long tables displayed pressed ferns, labeled mineral collections, and rows of watercolor plates. Her 3 pieces hung on a side wall, a study of the native bee orchid, a spray of foxgloves in luminous purple, and a delicate rendering of the rare ghost orchid that had bloomed miraculously in the Thornwood glasshouse. Each was framed in simple oak, unsigned except for the initial. She stood before them, barely breathing, as strangers paused and murmured. "Exquisite," an elderly lady said. "Quite remarkable," a gentleman agreed, adjusting his spectacles. "Who is E. Ashworth?" someone asked. Mr. William Ashby appeared at her elbow, quiet as a shadow. "Your Grace, they are talking of nothing else. You have done it." She turned to him, eyes shining with something that was not quite tears. "I did not think anyone would care." "I care," he said, "and I am not the only one." Then the crowd shifted, and she saw her husband. The Duke of Ashworth stood at the entrance of the Assembly Room, still in his riding coat, his expression utterly unreadable. He had not been expected. He must have ridden hard from London, for dust clung to his boots and his cravat was askew. He was staring at the wall, at the 3 framed illustrations, at the small card that read E. Ashworth, crossed the room slowly. The crowd parted for him instinctively, the way it always did for dukes. When he reached her, he did not look at Mr. Ashby. He looked only at his wife. "You drew these," he said. It was not a question. Elena lifted her chin. "Yes." Stared at her as though seeing a stranger. "Why did you never tell me?" The question hung in the air, and something inside her, something that had been building for 3 long years, finally snapped, "Tell you." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "When, Your Grace, at breakfast, when you read your correspondence and do not speak. At dinner, when you address the footman more warmly than your own wife. I have been invisible to you since our wedding day. I stopped hoping you would see me. So I made a life. You did not need to notice." The silence that followed was absolute. Several ladies put their hands to their mouths. Mr. Ashby stepped discreetly back, his expression pained but respectful. The Duke's face had gone very pale. Alana, he began, but she shook her head. I am tired, Your Grace. I wish to return home. Shakatsud, perfectly correct, and walked out of the assembly room on legs that shook but did not falter. She did not look back. For 3 days the Duke did not approach her. He stayed in his study, and she stayed in the garden. The house felt taut, like a string stretched to breaking. Alana tended her plants with fierce concentration, refusing to let herself hope again. She had spoken truth, and truth was liberating, but it also left her feeling raw and exposed, as though she had shed a protective skin and was not yet certain the new one had formed. On the 4th evening, she found him in the walled garden. Standing by the fountain, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed. He did not look like a duke. He looked like a man who had not slept. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, and she saw that his eyes were rummed with red. I read my mother's journal, he said, his voice hoarse. I never knew she drew. I never knew any of it. I was sent away to school when I was 7. She died before I returned. Alana stopped a few paces away, her heart aching despite everything. I am sorry, shook his head. I had a sister, Mugrat named for her. She died of scarlet fever when I was 12. I was not allowed to grieve. My father told me that a duke must never show weakness, that feeling was a luxury I could not afford. I have spent my life believing him. He lifted his gaze to hers, and in it she saw a depth of pain that stole her breath. I have been frozen for so long, Alana. I did not realize I was freezing you too. She did not speak. She could not. I saw you at that exhibition, he continued, his voice breaking, and I saw a woman I have never met. A woman of talent and passion and quiet strength. A woman I have ignored for 3 years while she built something beautiful in the wreckage I left her in. I have no right to ask your forgiveness. I have no right to anything. But I am asking, will you let me try? Will you let me learn to be the man you deserved from the Bagunang? Her vision blurred. She had waited so long to hear such words, but she was no longer the girl who would have fallen into his arms at the first whisper of kindness. She had grown roots. She had learned to stand alone. Easy, Your Grace, she said softly. I need more than words. He nodded, his jaw tight. Then I will show you. He began simply by staying. The London business was delegated. The constant departures stopped. He started appearing in the garden every morning, not with demands or declarations, but with a quiet, awkward presence. He asked her to teach him. She was cautious, but she showed him how to prune the roses, how to test the soil's moisture, how to stake a leaning stem. His hands, so elegant on a quill or a rein, were clumsy with the trowel, but he did not complain. He listened. One afternoon, kneeling in the dirt beside her, he said, Tell me about the ghost orchid. She glanced at him, surprised. It is rare. It blooms only in perfect conditions. For years I thought the one in the glass house was dead, but it was only waiting. Watang, he repeated quietly. I understand that. She looked away, but something in her chest eased. He asked her about her childhood, and she told him about her father's smussovness, her hidden sketchbooks, the loneliness of a house where she was a disappointment. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, You have always been more than anyone allowed you to be, especially me. One evening, he came to her with a leather portfolio. Inside was a letter from the Royal Horticultural Society praising her illustrations and inviting her to submit a full collection for publication. She stared at the seal, her hands shaking. How did they see my work? I hesitated. I sent them copies. I took the liberty of having plates made from your sketchbook. I did not put my name, only yours, Alana, Duchess of Ushwath. I wanted the world to see you as I am finally learning to see you, spilled over her lashes. You did that? For Ma, I would do 1,000 such things, he said, if it would buy back a single hour of the loneliness I caused you. She did not forgive him then. Forgiveness was not a single moment. It was a slow thaw, a season turning, but she let him take her hand. She let him sit beside her in the glass house while the ghost orchid bloomed, its pale petals luminous in the twilight. She let him begin to know her. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Old wounds ached. There were nights she still felt the phantom chill of his neglect and pulled away, and he would accept it without reproach, waiting patiently. He told her more about his sister, about the boy he had been before his father crushed the tenderness from him, and she saw the damaged man inside the cold duke. He was not cruel. He had been terrified of feeling, of losing, of being unworthy of love. In his fear, he had become the very thing that hurt her most. He changed in visible ways. He instructed his steward to fund a village botanical society, with Alana as its patron. He hosted a garden party to showcase her revived gardens, and stood at her side while the county's finest praised her achievements. He learned the Latin names of every plant in the glass house and recited them to her with mock solemnity until she laughed, a real laugh, the first he had ever heard, and the sound made his eyes glisten. One autumn evening, they walked together through the walled garden. The air smelled of wood smoke and ripening apples. He stopped beneath the archway where the ivy was now tamed and healthy, and he reached into his coat. "I have something for you," he said. It was a small leather box. Inside, on a bed of velvet, lay a brooch in the shape of a ghost orchid, wrought in silver and pale enamel, so delicate it seemed to tremble. "It is not enough," he said, his voice unsteady. "Nothing I do will ever be enough to balance the scales, but I want you to have a symbol of what you have taught me. You waited in silence and pain, and you grew something beautiful from nothing. I do not deserve you, but I love you, Alana. I love you with a heart that is finally, painfully alive, and I will spend every day of my life proving it if you will let me." She looked at the brooch, at the man before her, and saw the truth of him, flawed, earnest, trying. She thought of the girl who had stood frozen in a ballroom, invisible and unloved. She was not that girl anymore. She was a woman who had learned to bloom without sun, and who now, unexpectedly, was being offered warmth. She took the brooch. She pinned it to her gown, over her heart. Then she reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw as she had dreamed of doing 1,000 times. "I have loved you since the day we wed," she whispered. "I never stopped. I only stopped hopping, but you have given me hope again. That is a gift I do not take lightly." His breath left him in a shudder. "I will not waste it." She smiled, and it was a smile that held both sorrow and joy, the ache of years and the fragile bloom of something new. "Then do not." Kissed her then beneath the archway as the first stars pricked the dusk. It was not a conquering kiss, not a claim. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a plea. She leaned into him, and the last of the ice inside her melted into something warm and living. The years that followed were not without shadows, but they were years of partnership. The Duchess of Ashworth's botanical illustrations were published by the Royal Horticultural Society to great acclaim. Her gardens became a destination for scholars and enthusiasts across England. And the Duke, the man who had once been a ghost in his own home, became her most devoted student, her fiercest champion, and the man who never again let a day pass without telling her she was seen. On a spring morning, 3 years after the exhibition that had changed everything, Elena stood in the glass house with her husband beside her, a small daughter perched on her hip. The child reached out chubby fingers toward the ghost orchid, which bloomed again on its mossy mount. "Careful, little one," the Duke murmured, wrapping an arm around his wife's waist. "Some things are precious beyond measure." Elena leaned into him, her heart so full it ached. "They bloom best when they are cherished." He pressed his lips to her temple. "Then I shall cherish you both until the end of my days." Outside, the walled garden was a riot of color, every bed and border evidence of love and labor. The fountains sang, the roses climbed, and the quiet Duchess who had once been invisible stood at the center of it all, utterly, radiantly seen.